And today we have a very, very special guest. Some of you have already asked, so I'm going to let you know we'll record the speech and post it. I didn't want to give it away, so we didn't announce it so people would come. And we will record it and post it. So for those of you who have friends who wanted to see it, who couldn't make it today, Brian Murphy will make sure it's fully edited to be beautiful and to be posted. So it's my pleasure to introduce a very important and rare guest who has actually been in retirement, but for UVA, he decided to come up for 3 days, and we're really appreciative. This is Dr. Richard Bush, of course, a longtime friend and mentor of mine, one of America's leading scholars on Taiwan, Hong Kong, East Asia. Richard has done more than just study the region. He's lived there and been an active player in the American policy arena. After spending a decade of his childhood, actually, his family lived in the Philippines. He actually attended English Civil Foundation secondary school in Hong Kong, King George V, I believe, and counts himself as Asian in that regard. Richard got his bachelor's degree in political science from Lawrence University before getting his master's and PhD in Chinese politics from Columbia in the 1970s. And that included a year-long stint living in Taiwan. After successfully defending his dissertation about the textile industry in Hong Kong, Richard got a position at the China Council of Asia Society, where he worked for 5 years. And he threw himself in the policy-making arena, and lost my spot. So much to say about Richard. He served as a staff consultant on the House Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs under Stephen Solars for a decade, and then several positions on the House Committee of Foreign Affairs and the National Intelligence Council, advising on East Asian affairs. Most importantly, Richard played a very important role in Taiwan's democratization. It has been hugely important to the island's governance and evolution as a democratic country. From 1997 to 2002, Richard served as the Washington-based chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan, which oversees the de facto embassy and consulates in Taiwan. It was a momentous time for that position. As we all know, Taiwan had just experienced the missile crisis of 1995 to 1996. It would have its first peaceful transfer of power when Chen Shui-bian was elected in 2000. And China and Taiwan both acceded to the WTO in 2001 and 2002, respectively. He guided U.S. policy admirably and ably. After his time as chairman of AIT in 2002, Richard became director for the Center on Northeast Asian Policy Studies, now the Center for East Asian Policy Studies at Brookings, and remained in that role until he retired in 2018. He also served as Brookings' inaugural chair in Taiwan Studies from 2013 to 2020, and he is now a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for East Asian Policy Studies and the Thornton China Center. We have also been fortunate that between all of those positions Richard has held, he's been a prolific author, publishing a number of seminal works on the East Asian region. In the past decade, he's published Uncharted Strait, The Future of China-Taiwan Relations, Hong Kong in the Shadow of China, and most recently, Difficult Choices, Taiwan's Quest for Security and the Good Life. Over the years, I think I have met with Richard often in Hong Kong, where I usually live. I know how much he cares about Hong Kong, where he attended, as I said, secondary school as a teenager. His scholarship is closely related to my own research on Taiwan's China dilemma and on the high-income trap, challenges facing Asia-Pacific countries and societies. I have to say there's no one better to speak about those challenges than Richard. As a close observer of Taiwan and Hong Kong since their democratic awakenings, Richard is not shy to criticize the U.S., Taiwan, or Hong Kong policies, and has exhibited outstanding insight on their current situations and futures. More than anything, Richard and his wife Marty have been mentors and friends to countless number of leaders in Asia and in the U.S., and to scholars focusing on the Taiwan Strait and East Asia. I've been fortunate to count him as a mentor in so many ways. Without further ado, let's offer a warm welcome to Dr. Richard Bush.
So I'm off to a good start. I got down those stairs without stumbling. Shirley, thank you very much for that excessively generous introduction. Thank you to the East Asia Center, the UVA Global, and the Miller Center for inviting me to speak to you today. I hope that my remarks will stimulate a good discussion during the Q&A. Can't cover all the relevant topics, so anything you want to talk about is fair game. Now, you may be a bit confused, or you may actually be seriously annoyed by the title of my talk, China's Hong Kong and Taiwan Problems. You're probably thinking that it's Hong Kong and Taiwan that have a China problem, not the other way around, and you would be right. It was China that in 2020 imposed a national security law on Hong Kong. That law has constrained the exercise of civil and political rights in the city in violation of Beijing's original commitments. Concerning Taiwan, it is China that, since 2016, has mounted a multifaceted campaign of coercion against the island's government and people, which some international media have warned is preparation for a military campaign. I don't agree with that, but that's been the coverage. But bear with me. Since 1979, Beijing's goal was to incorporate Taiwan and Hong Kong into the People's Republic of China state system, and to do so peacefully and through persuasion. Its reasons were several. China first wanted to learn and benefit from Hong Kong and Taiwan's economic policies of export-led growth. It wanted to copy those economies to create prosperity for the Chinese people and, in the process, restore the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Second, China wanted to end the regime on Taiwan, which calls itself the Republic of China, and had been led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. It wanted to end the sovereignty of the United Kingdom over Hong Kong. Third, it wanted to restore the territorial boundaries of the last Chinese imperial dynasty, and so wipe out the shame of the so-called century of humiliation. Beijing's approach to both Hong Kong and Taiwan has failed, but in different ways in each place. And the purpose of my talk is to explain why its policy of unification through persuasion didn't work. With your indulgence, I would like to tell you a little bit more about myself beyond what Professor Lin has provided you, and how I came to do both diplomacy and scholarship concerning Taiwan and Hong Kong. The main reason was that in 1960, when I was 12 years old, our family was on the way to Burma. My father was a Methodist missionary who wanted to study Theravada Buddhism, and Burma was a good place to do it, or so he thought. The Burmese government had a different opinion, and it denied us a visa. As a result, living in Hong Kong became Plan B. That almost random shift in our plans would lead me later to China for my adult career. And I'm still doing it, so I feel very lucky. My initial focus was on the PRC, not Hong Kong or Taiwan, but from 1983 to 95, I worked on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And my boss for most of that time was Representative Steve Solars, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. And he placed special attention on promoting democracy and human rights in Taiwan. So in the process, I learned a lot about Taiwan politics and got to know a lot of Taiwan politicians. In 1997, I was fortunate to be appointed chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan. That was because my predecessor was soliciting campaign contributions in Taiwan from Taiwanese for Bill Clinton's presidential campaign. Manifestly illegal. And he was fired and I was hired. So it worked out good for me. So as a result of all this, both Taiwan and Hong Kong have had a special place during my career. And then I was lucky enough to go to Brookings, where I could think about those issues and write about them. So I've been very fortunate. I didn't always know that these jobs were available at the outset, but it all worked out. So let's go back to today's topic. And I think that to understand the Taiwan and Hong Kong situation today, we've got to go back to the early 1980s when PRC leaders were formulating a policy for incorporating Hong Kong and Taiwan into the PRC. And I've explained why they wanted to do that. Now, I'm going to outline the policy adopted, then discuss the application first to Hong Kong, and then after a few questions, shift over to Taiwan, and we'll have time for more questions. So Chinese leaders realized that to succeed, they had to maintain the standard of living of both places and allay the fear that citizens of those places had about living under a communist government, even nominally. Many of those Hong Kong and Taiwan people had fled China in 1949 and afterwards out of fear of the Communist Party. Beijing also knew that it had to reassure the United States and Britain about the future of Hong Kong and Taiwan. And finally, Beijing was determined to maintain sufficient political control over each place. Now, China hoped that it could persuade the British concerning Hong Kong and the regime ruling Taiwan, called the Kuomintang or the KMT, to accept one country, two systems, which it was its formula. And the PRC took hope from several optimistic assumptions. The people of the two territories were ethnic Chinese, so naturally they would ultimately want to join their ethnic brothers and sisters in the PRC. As good Marxists, PRC leaders believed that capitalist societies were controlled by capitalists. So if they could facilitate Taiwan and Hong Kong companies benefiting from China's new policies of reform and opening up, which they did, they would support pro-China policies domestically. Third, Chinese leaders assumed that people in Hong Kong and Taiwan would recognize the PRC's growing power and sooner or later accommodate to it. Fourth, in the early 1980s, neither Hong Kong nor Taiwan was a democracy, so the authorities there could negotiate unification without worrying about public opinion. Thus, I mentioned one country, two systems. This was Deng Xiaoping's formula for unification. It involved creating a new entity within the PRC system called the Special Administrative Region. And Hong Kong and Taiwan would now belong to the PRC, the one country. But they would keep their capitalist systems and not have to adopt the PRC's socialist system. Note that the second system in the formula, one country, two systems, was not the political system, but the economic system. Beijing did promise that the two territories would have, quote, a high degree of autonomy, and that the territories would be administered by local people. But there was a catch, and that was that the local people who ran Hong Kong and Taiwan under this concept had to be patriots. That is, they had to be people who were deemed loyal to Beijing. Deng was willing to grant a form of home rule, but he wanted veto power over who ruled at home. The key for him was ultimate control of the key levers of power. This is where the term Semi-Leninist comes into the title of my talk. When a communist party can't impose complete control over a society that it would like to control, it tries to do so indirectly through a united front composed of loyal indigenous allies who will protect its interests. The Chinese Communist Party had long employed a united front approach to Hong Kong during the period of British rule. As it prepared to take over Hong Kong in 1997, it adapted this united front approach to its new Hong Kong political order. Concerning Taiwan, Beijing hoped that capitalists would support unification, but it also had an additional goal, and that was to end American support for the island's security. PRC leaders believed that as long as Taiwan leaders felt secure, they would not negotiate on unification. But Beijing thought it had convinced Washington to end its protection of Taiwan by the early 1980s. Thus, it was plausible to conclude that by the mid-1980s, PRC leaders believed that the one country, two systems formula could work in both Hong Kong and Taiwan, especially if politics in those places continued to be demobilized, which they were at the time. Now let's turn to the application of one country, two systems to Hong Kong, where it was actually applied. China began negotiations with Great Britain around 1980, 1981. London thought its economic relationship with all of China was more important than keeping Taiwan, Hong Kong. Moreover, it faced a deadline in 1997 when a significant amount of the territory of Hong Kong, which was under a lease from China to Britain, would revert. The lease would expire and the territory would revert. Britain decided that there was no way it could keep rump Hong Kong. The whole thing would have to be transferred. But it did want to assure Hong Kong people that they would not suffer from Hong Kong's reversion to China. British negotiators did something that was actually rather clever. They argued to their Chinese counterparts that a successful capitalist system had several essential institutional issues. They were the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and the protection of civil and political rights. Chinese leaders went along with this proposal. What did they really know about capitalism? So they included a commitment to these three elements in the PRC-UK Joint Declaration of 1984. It happens, as you probably know, that these institutions are also part of what makes a liberal democracy liberal. This was another reason that Hong Kong's political system is only semi-Leninist, because it had democratic institutions in it. The British also pushed for universal popular elections for the chief executive and the legislative council. Chinese negotiators rejected that. That was part of their control strategy. In 1990, China's National People's Congress passed the Hong Kong Basic Law. It retained the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and the protection of civil and political rights. It authorized popular elections for LegCo seats, but not all. The rest of LegCo, plus the chief executive, would be picked by bodies with members of the regime. In fact, China was able to rig the electoral system so it could maintain control where it counted. After Hong Kong returned to China in 1997, it had created a partial democracy for a liberal oligarchy. Hong Kong did have success stories after reversion. Despite regional and global economic crises, the economy over time performed pretty well, and Hong Kong became an international financial center. This was a vibrant and talented society with a highly educated population. It was both ethnically Chinese and cosmopolitan. It was both Confucian and modern. People generally were pragmatic but socially conservative. When I visited Hong Kong, as I did sort of many times in the 2000s and 2010s, I had to travel on the subway so I could see what a lively, normal, and content society it was. One could conclude that one country, two systems might actually work. On the other hand, there were a number of warning signs. First of all, Beijing continued to worry about whether it had sufficient control over Hong Kong. The number of anti-government demonstrations was rising. Color revolutions in various countries and the Arab Spring showed Beijing how quickly popular revolts could erupt. Second, there was a growing sense of economic grievance in Hong Kong. The benefits of growth had long been uneven. Hong Kong has a pretty high rate of inequality of both income and wealth. Access to housing was also unequal, and the young couple's inability to buy a dwelling constrained their willingness to get married. Political power obviously was also concentrated. So the conclusion that Hong Kong Democrats came to was that if this political and economic inequality was to be reduced, which they had reason to believe the public wanted, then they would have to change the electoral system. Third, late in the 2000s, some Hong Kong groups began ignoring the legal requirements that they get police permission for a proposed demonstration. Social movements proliferated and the protest culture was expanding. Moreover, the pro-democracy camp was increasingly split over whether to continue moderate tactics or act more provocative. It was this radical faction that pushed for more provocative protests. Fourth, there was an emerging sense in Hong Kong of a Hong Kong identity as opposed to a Chinese national identity, or at least a dual identity. You remember the assumptions that I mentioned at the beginning about identity and materialism and so on. And these assumptions were not holding up in Hong Kong. So when Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012, he placed generally a heightened emphasis on the protection of national security, by which he really meant internal security. And this interpretation of national security policy would affect how political reform was debated in Hong Kong. Now, to get to electoral reform, back in 2007, Beijing had announced that after 2012, it was prepared to move gradually towards the election of the chief executive through what it called universal suffrage. Discussions accelerated in 2013 as Beijing, the Hong Kong government, the business establishment, and the pan-democratic coalition put forward their ideas. It would not have been impossible for various actors to have come to a mutually acceptable arrangement, but that didn't happen. You probably recall the umbrella movement, the occupation of 3 major Hong Kong thoroughfares by young, committed members of the establishment camp in the fall of 2014. But in the end, the effort collapsed. I don't have time to go through the details, but here are some key factors. As before, Beijing's priority was maintaining control. It was willing to have Hong Kong elect the chief executive, but it wanted to maintain control over nominations. The pro-democracy camp thought that this was just a new way of rigging the electoral system. Many ideas were put forward to render the process less rigged, but they were rejected. The umbrella movement and the disruption it caused led Beijing to worry about a color revolution, Hong Kong style. There were serious splits within the Democratic camp over strategy and tactics. As one older Democratic activist said recently, the movement didn't understand the art of advance and retreat. That is the radical wing of the movement. The Democratic camp didn't agree on a minimally acceptable outcome, and radical elements dominated. As time went on, mistrust deepened. Late in the process, the Hong Kong government tried to amend the proposed system to make that possible, and Democrats were too divided and mistrustful of the government to respond positively. So the Hong Kong situation remained relatively calm until 2019, when a new issue surfaced, that is the transfer of fugitives from Hong Kong to other jurisdictions, with which Hong Kong did not have extradition agreements. This started as a simple case that related to Taiwan, But the Hong Kong government came up with a comprehensive policy proposal that tried to cover all potential situations. And Democrats believed this would permit the transfer of anti-China Hong Kong dissidents to Beijing's jurisdiction without judicial review. Protests began in June 2019, and they posed a greater challenge to the authorities than those of 2014. They were generally peaceful, but the level of violence, both by protesters and the police, was higher than the umbrella movement. The movement was suppressed, but Beijing was even more concerned about losing control. Late June 2020, the Standing Committee of the Chinese National People's Congress enacted a national security law for Hong Kong. Protection of civil and political rights were no longer guaranteed. Limits were placed on which members of the anti-establishment camp could participate in elections, leaving the system more rigged than it was in 1997. Moreover, enforcement was no longer the responsibility of the Hong Kong government alone. Agencies of the PRC government were set up in Hong Kong to enhance enforcement. The net effect of the law was to sharply circumscribe the civil and political rights that the basic law mandated and to constrain the role of the courts. In short, Hong Kong's experience under one country, two systems has ended badly. A vibrant society is no longer so vibrant. The lives of many young people will never be the same, and many will never achieve their life goals. Intellectuals and university professors must hunker down, and even that may not be enough to avoid the national security threat. Many activists are in jail. Reportedly, families and individuals are leaving every day for safer destinations. And having lived in the city as a teenager and visited many times since the 1980s, this outcome saddens me greatly. What are the prospects of the future for Hong Kong? I seriously doubt that there will be any change for the better while Xi Jinping is in power. Moreover, this is not just a Xi Jinping problem. The PRC system does place a high priority on preserving control. The danger is that, as the saying goes, Hong Kong will become like every other Chinese city. Perhaps the best hope is that the Hong Kong business elite will conclude that its interests require Hong Kong to remain better than other Chinese cities, and that includes some degree of political reliberalization. Right now, however, the Hong Kong elite seems quite comfortable with the way things work out. I don't believe there's anything the United States can do to fundamentally change Hong Kong's new political system for the better. The U.S. government has sanctioned PRC and Hong Kong officials it deems responsible for the crackdown and suspended some forms of intergovernmental cooperation. But that won't lessen the PRC's imperative for control. In the near term, the best thing we can do is to facilitate the relocation to the United States of Hong Kong people who are seeking a safe harbor from the storms of the last few years. There's another consequence for China of the failure of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, and that's the impact that same policy towards Taiwan. I want to turn to that in about 15 minutes, but first I'd like to take any questions you have about Hong Kong.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe for the questions, we'll take off the screen and we can see Richard. Yeah, I should have announced at the beginning. So Richard has kindly decided to take questions for Hong Kong first, and then Taiwan, and then also answer questions about his personal journey on
Yes.
public service. I actually promoted your speech based on that in the
Okay.
email. So many of you may have come with questions about joining the government and otherwise.
That's fine. So any questions about Hong Kong? Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just wondering, what would be your prediction on the new upcoming chief executive of Hong Kong? Do you think the chief executive of Hong Kong, because in the past, like they were relying on this model of like getting elites to be the chief executive with the current changes? What would be your prediction of this person? Like what character would Beijing favor?
Well, I would predict that the new chief executive will either be a senior civil servant or a prominent businessman. Their experience in businessman hasn't been great because they have no governmental experience. The rumor is that the Secretary of Finance, Paul Chan, right, is liable to succeed Carrie Lam. But I would also, I wouldn't rule out John Lee, the Secretary for Security, given the PRC's main imperative of control. But those are just guesses. We'll see what happens. Another question? You can ask Hong Kong questions later if they come to you later on, but that's fine. Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So I appreciated your framing of semi-Leninism. This is also more of a recent question, looking at the PostNational Security Law. So there was a lot of discussion about what the potential implications of the national security law are. But I was curious from your research what you've seen as kind of the outcome, the outcomes that we've seen so far in the Hong Kong context. So are there any examples that you saw that were particularly troubling or demonstrated a kind of expansiveness of the national security law beyond what we saw with the arrests of protesters and people fleeing, but things that we might not expect, that we might not see in the news?
Let me give you an example, and I have to be careful here. In Hong Kong, there is something called the Central Grants Committee.
UCG.
This gets government funding to support research by Hong Kong scholars. I know of at least one scholar who came to the conclusion that proposed changes in that mission would create ideological limits on what people could do research about, and that it was no longer safe for him to stay in Hong Kong. He may have overreacted to the news that the grants committee was going to be, in effect, reined in, but he didn't want to take that chance. So he left family there, doesn't have a job. But this is the kind of environment that people live in. People who've been public intellectuals may get targeted for having freely expressed their views when they were allowed to do so. So it's not a good situation. And to the extent that a modern society like Hong Kong needs the free exchange of ideas to identify both problems and opportunities, it's been severely restricted.
Right.
Yeah, I want to bring up, I think one of the points you started with is that the PRC first thought they had to keep Hong Kong and Taiwan the way they were so they could learn from them.
Yes.
My first visit in Hong Kong was 1991, and I was moved around by a very successful businessman, and I asked him how he thought things were going to go. And one way of summarizing what he said is that I think we'll take over China. And there's a certain sense in which that happened from a kind of economic point of view. Now, if that was predicated on the freedoms of a liberal polity, is Xi Jinping going to destroy what he's absorbed from Hong Kong by tightening things up?
Your friend's prediction was common at the time. If the the only way that Hong Kong changed China was for Hong Kong's success in countering corruption was applied to China. Hong Kong has an independent anti-corruption commission, or did, and they developed a variety of tools for reducing and deterring corruption. But as we've seen, China, after Hong Kong's reversion, became even more corrupt than it was, and Xi Jinping has cracked down on corruption, but he's done it in a way that suggests that he's going after his political rivals as much as reducing corruption. I think that another thing that happened was that Hong Kong had unexpected difficulties in the economic sphere. And the first one happened the day after Hong Kong officially reverted to China. The Asian financial crisis began, and this had a huge impact on the housing market in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, but also in people's incomes. And so it was the PRC that had to come in and, in a way, help bail Hong Kong out and create preferential policies that would benefit the city. This didn't always work out in the way that was planned. One of the beneficial policies was to allow a lot more mainland Chinese to come over to Hong Kong as tourists and shop in luxury stores and stay in five-star hotels and so on. But the result of this was to alienate Hong Kong people. A friend of mine resented the fact that the traditional areas of the city where Hong Kong people went to shop for this and that had been taken over by luxury stores, and he no longer could do it. When food safety became an important issue within the PRC, some mainland Chinese would come across the border in the morning and buy up all the milk powder for babies, for example, and then go back in the evening. And so there was not enough milk powder left for Hong Kong parents. This, again, was a source of resentment. So I admire your friend's optimism. I wish that it had worked out that way, but it didn't. So,
Glenn.
Can you talk a little bit more about the elite business class and how much leverage they have to eventually pry a little more liberty from the government? You said that they're not trying, but I'm guessing there must be some variation. Maybe some of them are testing the limits a little bit. And do you see any evidence for that potential of more movement by the elite to push for restoration of some rule of law?
Not so far. I will emphasize I'm retired and sort of doing other stuff, but what I read daily in the press doesn't suggest it. I think that it would take some time for this need for reliberalization to emerge. The Hong Kong tycoons who might be farsighted enough to see this as a necessary change, they would want to make sure that they raise the issue at the right time in order to get the right response from their Chinese masters. And that time may take a while in coming.
Olivia, she also went to school in Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah, I went
yes.
to a GSIS in Hong
Oh,
Kong.
okay.
Anyways, my question is, so you talked about in the beginning how China's or Beijing's obsession with Hong Kong was mostly to do with like its export-led growth economy and like really utilizing all the money and benefit it could give to Beijing. But now if we look at what's happening in Hong Kong, like tons of people are leaving, fleeing, like the economy, I don't think is as bustling or vibrant as it had been like 10 years ago. So if PRC's end for wanting like Hong Kong to be annexed back to China isn't about economy anymore or like making money, what do you think is the real end? Is it just like shame from the 1900s, or just wanting to have Hong Kong as part of it because of like autonomy for land, or what's the like for Hong Kong becoming part of China?
It's a good question. Certainly, if you go back to 1979, economically, China needed Hong Kong a lot more than Hong Kong needed China. But as China learned the art of export-led growth and learned the art of a lot of other things, Hong Kong became less important as Hong Kong faced economic difficulties and began to depend on PRC policy changes to correct those difficulties. Hong Kong was needing the PRC more than the PRC was needing Hong Kong. And I think that's what it's got to. I think that there's one area where the PRC still finds Hong Kong valuable, and that is in financial services. China would like at some day to make the renminbi fully convertible. And there are a lot of aspects to that task, and Hong Kong financial people can help them do that and have helped them do that. And so it's a good test bed for sort of changing the role of the RMB in the international economy. But the situation is now, first of all, preventing things from getting worse from China's point of view, and hopefully finding ways to reduce the alienation that people feel. One hears from time to time, if only we could have more housing, young people would be happy and our political problems would go away. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but how the housing situation does need to be fixed. So is there another question? Yes, ma'am.
Just to kind of follow up on what you said about Hong Kong being the financial hub of of East Asia. I was thinking that despite of the fact that China has imposed a lot of like internet restriction or currency control or curbs on making deals in Hong Kong, its status as a financial hub hasn't really changed throughout the past 2 years. So what do you think what kind of action do you think that China would have taken that would really shake in the status of the financial hub and kind of like evoke series of reaction from the international players? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. The one thing that comes to mind is that it's actually a good thing for a bunch of international banks to have a strong presence in Hong Kong. And if those banks find that the political environment is such and that the information flow environment is such that they can't do their business, they'll move to Singapore. I mean, there are already foreign businessmen moving to Singapore. They might move to Tokyo. So that's not the end of the world for Hong Kong, but and maybe some in China would be happy to see the foreigners go. But that's the thing that comes immediately to mind. Did you have a question, sir? No. Okay.
There's one more.
Okay. I'm sorry.
I have a question. So, from your perspective, what would be the difference between Hong Kong and other mainland cities, such as Shanghai, 10 years later?
What I hope is that you do not have a system where the Chinese Communist Party is deeply embedded in Hong Kong society, where the Communist Party is not a parallel authority structure within economic entities and social entities and so on. The Chinese Communist Party, I expect, has a presence in Hong Kong, but it has been a restrained presence, and that it's growing more prominent. But to be a really Chinese city, that would be the most important change that could occur. And I'm sure that the Hong Kong government would prefer not to have a competing power center. So I hope it doesn't happen.
There's
Yes.
I have a question. So, like, America's mostly responded to Chinese crackdowns through economic sanctions. For example, it has withdrew Hong Kong special status after
Yes.
the passage of national security laws. And I'm wondering, like, in your opinion, do you think such responses are adequate and effective? For example, should America have provided more protection for Hong Kong dissidents? And I'm also wondering, like, do you think in the future would the international society keep on pressuring the PRC for like more changes in Hong Kong through the form of economic sanction or like local condemnation?
You may know, living in Virginia, that economic sanctions first became a tool for American foreign policy back during the administration of James Madison, whose home is just up the road here. And he really believed in the power of economic sanctions, and they didn't really work out the way he thought. But we have a long tradition of trying to exert power in this way. There's a technical aspect of this, and that is that the way our political system works, imposing sanctions on foreigners is one of the powers that the Congress in effect has. There are a lot of things that Congress would like to do that are completely within the purview of the executive branch, but sanctioning individuals is one that Congress has. So it employs that tool more than may be necessary. I actually think that it would be a good idea at some point for the U.S. administration to go down the list of people who've been sanctioned and go down the ways in which our relations with the Hong Kong government has been suspended, and just examine, is it really in our interest to continue each of these? And what could we get by starting to lift some of these sanctions? There might be a value in that at some point. We would have to see some reason to justify doing it, but it's not impossible. Maybe I should switch to Taiwan, and then we'll come back. I'll get your question. So not so long ago, a scholar friend of mine in China remarked that the PRC officials who formulated the one country, two systems unification proposal back in the early 1980s had made a fundamental error. And the error was to apply the same formula to both Hong Kong and Taiwan. PRC officials had focused on the apparent similarities between the two places, but my friend is correct, basically. Each territory had a very different legal status. Hong Kong was a dependent territory of the UK, and the UK would make the basic decisions about the city's fate, and it did. Taiwan, whose official name is the Republic of China, was a rival government to the People's Republic, and it would make its own decisions about one country, two systems. Indeed, in the 1980s, early 1980s, the KMT regime rejected the offer out of hand. It was strongly opposed at that time to any negotiations with Beijing. And it is always held to the belief that the Republic of China is a sovereign state on a legal par with the PRC. And under one country, two systems, Taiwan would only be an entity subordinate to the PRC government. The second major difference had to do with security. Britain had no intention of defending Hong Kong if China threatened to take it by force. The PRC stance towards Taiwan was different. We did terminate the defense treaty we had with Taiwan in 1979-80, and China got the Reagan administration to agree to restraints on arms sales, or so it thought. Beijing thought that it placed Taiwan in an increasingly weak political position. But successive U.S. administrations have since sought to help Taiwan strengthen its defenses, including through arms sales. But there are other significant differences between Hong Kong and Taiwan. And here, in thinking about how one country, two systems might be applied to Taiwan, I'm relying on the Hong Kong Basic Law as my point of reference. Since it was the most detailed and, in retrospect, the most positive elaboration of the one country, two systems formula. The major difference between the two places is that for Hong Kong, the Basic Law was enacted long before Hong Kong reverted to China and long before the expansion of political participation in the city. In Taiwan, on the other hand, the transition to democracy began in the mid-1980s and was completed by 1994. With it came an expansion of participation. In the mid-1990s, Beijing and Taipei were only beginning to lay out their general and conflicting concepts about unification. So this sequencing of democratization versus negotiations has had several consequences. First of all, democratization gave the Taiwan public a seat at the negotiating table in any dealings with China. Candidates for the legislative yuan and the presidency would have to compete for voters' support and be responsive to their views on China. Second, democratization prompted the creation of new political forces, political parties, and civil society groups that questioned the government's policies and competed in elections. The most important of these was the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, which was founded in September 1986. Third, democratization gave parties and the people the freedom to advocate ideas that previously were taboo. Some opposition leaders in the DPP advocated for de jure independence, for a Republic of Taiwan, in effect, something that China strongly opposed and the United States did not support. The idea also happened to be unpopular with Taiwan voters who understood that independence probably meant war. So the DPP has sort of left that one to the side and promoted other issues. Fourth, democratization led to a shift in identity, the territory with which people identify, Taiwan or China. And the situation today is that those Taiwan citizens who identify with Taiwan or identify with both China and Taiwan have constituted 90% of those polled for a long time. Those who say they're Chinese is below 10. These changes in identity did not necessarily mean that hostility with China was inevitable. For one thing, the terms used in identity polling have never been defined. The respondents defined them for themselves. More important, Taiwan companies were moving operations to the mainland. We created a boost for the Taiwan economy, an employment of Taiwanese in a lot of new jobs, and greater wealth for a lot of families. And this was a reason to support improving relations. The first high-level meeting between semi-officials of the two governments took place in April 1993. But progress has been slow along these lines because the DPP raised public anxiety that the KMT government might sell out Taiwan interests, and generally the Taiwan public has had second and third thoughts about unification. So even though good economic relations were important for Taiwan, their opposition to unification on China's terms was still strong. Among other things, people in Taiwan could read the Hong Kong Basic Law and could figure out that Hong Kong after 1997 would be a partial democracy only. Taiwan had already become a full democracy in 1994. So why would it go back to a partial democracy that, among other things, would exclude a major political force that Beijing has trusted, such as the DPP? Initially, the United States welcomed Taiwan's democratization. U.S. leaders soon learned that some of the consequences of democratization didn't accord with U.S. interests. The basic question is how Taiwan's presidents balance relations with China with domestic politics. President Lee Teng-hui, who served as president from 1988 to 2000, was a Taiwanese. He became president in 1988, as I said. For a while, he sought to improve cross-strait relations, but increasingly, the Taiwan public and the DPP called for greater international dignity for this new democracy. They wanted to reverse the PRC's multi-decade campaign to marginalize and exclude Taiwan from the international community. So to win the 1996 presidential election, Lee played up Taiwan nationalism and sought to enhance Taiwan's international dignity. And he pushed to secure a visit to the United States to give a speech at Cornell University. Honor. The Clinton administration initially opposed this, but under congressional pressure, President Clinton agreed to let Lee come. PRC leaders were convinced by now that Lee's true intention was the pursuit of an independent Taiwan. And it basically shifted its policy from promoting unification to opposing independence. Whereas Beijing had hoped to persuade Taiwan to accept unification on its terms, it exerted pressure to oppose independence. Taiwan's next president was Chen Shui-bian, who likely was a Taiwanese. The U.S. government at the time I was chairman of AIT was conscious of the need to cultivate Chen and his team and to have good communication. At one point, when he was paying an unofficial visit to Washington before the election, he and his delegation were even the guests at my dinner guests at my house for dinner. In many ways, to serve one's country. The Chen made some effort to engage the PRC at the beginning, but Beijing believed that was a deception, and he soon declared that the best way for him and his party to hold on to power was to stir up Taiwanese nationalism and provoke China. Because of this campaign strategy, the period around the 2008 election was seen in Beijing as a time of great danger. But as much as the Taiwan public was opposed to unification on China's terms, they wanted to deepen cross-strait economic cooperation, and they didn't want war, which they feared independence would bring. So at this point, sort of around 2005, the KMT smartly positioned itself as best able to manage the China relationship. And there was a meeting in April 2005 between this party chairman John and Hu Jintao in his capacity as chair of the CCP. The two agreed on some principles for setting cross-strait relations on a positive course. And Beijing had reason to hope that if the KMT returned to power, it would advance its goals in a semi-Leninist way. And the KMT did return to power in 2008. Ma Ying-jeou, the KMT's new chairman, advocated engaging China in the economic and social spheres, believing it would make Taiwan more secure. Voters agreed and swept the KMT victory over a weakened DPP. So Beijing now shifts its policy from opposing independence back to promoting unification. They accepted that resolving cross-strait disputes would have to be a gradual process, one that started with economic issues and then moved to political ones later. And during the first few years of Ma's administration, the two sides signed a number of agreements that won economic solutions. A significant agreement, both economically and politically, was the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, or ECFA, concluded in June 2010, and it was to be followed by agreements on trade in goods, trade in services, and other issues. The ultimate goal was a free trade area or a common market between the two sides of the strait. As a result, in 2012, Taiwan voters reaffirmed their support of Ma's policy by giving him a second term. Before long, however, there arose political opposition to Ma's cross-strait policies and to Ma himself. Taiwan identity grew stronger, particularly among young people. There were growing tensions within the KMT over mainland policy. In the public, not everyone was benefiting from economic engagement with China, and inequality remained high. Many young people found it hard to get good living jobs. Some forms of economic engagement bred popular resentment, such as a lot of Chinese tourists coming over to Taiwan. And this was the first time that the average Taiwanese was actually exposed to people from China. And the tourists did not always behave in ways that Taiwan residents found very civilized. Also, PRC businessmen were making investment in Taiwan real estate, driving up prices. And Taiwan's protest culture, which had weakened during the Chen Shui-bian years, quickly revived under Ma. Demonstrations often mobilized by social media became increasingly common. Furthermore, Beijing didn't just stick with economic issues. It did push Ma Ying-jeou a little bit to begin political talks. Ma understood that the public wasn't ready for that, and he demurred. So in this sense, Taiwan's democratic shield was serving its purpose. But matters came to a head in 2014, and the result was not good for Beijing or the KMT. Early that year, the Ma administration was trying to move through the legislature an agreement on trade and services. Conflicts between the KMT and DPP caucuses stimulated social movements to take over the legislative yuan on March 18th. This was the Sunflower Movement, and the occupation lasted till April 10th. And it essentially marked the end of any progress on cross-strait economic relations. From Beijing's point of view, the situation in Taiwan soon went from bad to worse. The DPP won an impressive victory at local elections in November of 2014. Then in January 2016, Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of the DPP, handily won the presidency, and her party gained a legislative majority for the first time. And Tsai was easily reelected in 2020. Now, there are many reasons for her victories, but PRC leaders still must have been puzzled at this outcome after it had extended to Taiwan what it believed were generous economic benefits. Maybe Taiwan people weren't Marxists after all. I would note that in the run-up to 2016 election, Beijing had set a couple of preconditions that Tsai Ing-wen would have to satisfy before Beijing would coexist with her. In my view, it set the bar purposefully high so that it was politically impractical for her to clear that bar. side did make an effort to reassure Beijing about her intentions, but Beijing chose not to take yes for an answer. Instead, Beijing shifted policy again from promoting unification to again opposing independence. The question was how, given the sweeping DPP victory. Although Beijing's phrase here is opposing independence, I think it's pretty clear that de jure independence really wasn't an option. Support for it is modest. 6% say they want it right away. 26 want to maintain the status quo now and perhaps do independence later. 56% of the people prefer the status quo. Support for independence is low if it means war, which most people believe it would be. The radical faction of the DPP does support independence, but it's a minority. And the public knows that the United States would not support a unilateral Taiwan Declaration of Independence. I actually believe that Beijing understands perfectly well that President Tsai has no intention to seek legal independence. The problem is that she and her party are opposed to unification. So coexisting with her will mean that China probably never achieves unification on its current terms. Accommodating Tsai, China fears, would be a sign of weakness. Chinese officials and scholars have a number of reasons why they say that the DPP is moving towards independence. But I think many of those speculations are not valid. I also think that sometimes people in the PRC feel that Taiwan's democracy is not truly authentic, and on that I think they're wrong. Political leaders have to be responsive to the public. So what are China's options? If PRC leaders believe they have to do something to make clear their opposition to Tsai and her party, what should they do? Some in China would like their government to go to war and solve China's Taiwan problem. And there are people in the West who believe that war is increasingly likely. Yet in my view, however, war is not really an option, at least right away, nor does Beijing see it as necessary. Beijing has incentives to avoid war. Foremost among those is that they prudently assume that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense. They are taking note of the brutal economic sanctions that we and others have imposed on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Under such circumstances, Beijing could not be assured of absolute victory, and anything short of quick and absolute unification would risk undermining Chinese Communist Party legitimacy at home. Also, China's use of force against Taiwan would poison its image in the region and around the world. Given the unattractiveness of the war option, it's little surprise that China has chosen a different path. It has unveiled a broad range of tools to deter Taiwan independence and gradually weaken the will of the people to resist integration with the mainland. China has targeted Taiwan economically, sought to induce a brain drain of Taiwan's top engineers to the mainland, isolated Taiwan in the world stage even more than it was before, fomented social divisions in Taiwan through support of political parties, through traditional media, through social media, It has launched cyber attacks and undertaken displays of military force, not the use of military force. The goal here is to constantly remind Taiwan people of China's growing power, induce pessimism in the island about the future, deepen splits within the island's political system, and show that outside powers are impotent to counter its coercion. This strategy may require more time than war, but it could come at less cost and risk to Beijing. China does pose a purely military threat to Taiwan, and Taiwan and the United States must strengthen their capacity to deter war. But the proximate threat is psychological rather than military, and defending against psychological pessimism is how you would deal with that pessimism is not so clear-cut as preparing for war. There is evidence that this strategy of coercion is working. Less than 15% of Taiwan people surveyed support unification either now or in the future. But when people are asked about the probability of unification actually occurring sometime in the future, the odds reported are about 50-50. So that pessimism is building. China can hope that the KMT will again present itself as a credible opposition to the DPP, and that Taiwan voters in 2024 will elect a KMT president who is friendly enough to the mainland to facilitate a return to promoting unification and persuasion. If that doesn't happen, and the DPP retains power, coercion without violence could conceivably continue. And war is held in reserve if Taipei actually grabs for independence. PRC leaders tend to believe that time's on their side and that they have the initiative. What bothers China now is more the support that the United States has shown for Taiwan, which Beijing says strengthens the Taiwan independent forces. The logic of current U.S. policy to overtly support Taiwan in the ways that it has is that because China is trying to undermine the confidence of Taiwan people, then we should take actions to bolster that confidence. To conclude, let me offer a few thoughts about Taiwan's democratic system through which the island's people and public must process challenging issues that they face. We should first acknowledge that there are several admirable points about Taiwan's democracy. The transition from authoritarianism to democracy was nonviolent and gradual. Elections run smoothly without disruption, unlike some places I could name. Over time, Taiwan's presidents from both parties have shaped their campaigns more and more according to the voters' preference for the status quo. The public believes that democracy is better than alternative systems. And that it works pretty well on Taiwan. However, a careful study of Taiwan's democracy suggests that the system is not very good at addressing tough issues. Political system is quite polarized between the DPP and its allied political parties on the one hand, and the KMT on the other. Polarization reduces the willingness to find compromises and to get policy solutions that are good enough. This is true of both domestic issues as well as external ones. For example, sustainable energy policy. Politicians have been debating conflicting priorities for decades. Fossil fuels versus nuclear and renewables, pricing electricity at cost versus subsidizing the price to benefit industry and consumers, meeting current needs versus slowing climate change. Economically, there's the age-old trade-off between promoting growth or equity and between keeping taxes low and raising revenue so the government has resources to carry out its tasks. Socially, there's the trade-off between the needs of a growing elderly age cohort and those of working people and their children. The biggest challenge, of course, is China, which is both Taiwan's number one trade and investment partner, but also the only security As I've already mentioned, the KMT argues that engaging China is the best way to ensure prosperity and security. The DPP prefers to enhance deterrence. Unfortunately, political polarization renders these different policy approaches as an either-or proposition. It sometimes seems that the KMT and the DPP each see each other as the main adversary rather than China. Moreover, the political system has a lot of veto points that those who oppose policy initiatives can try to block them. I've already mentioned this culture as manifest in the sunflower movement. But the result is that political forces in Taiwan are much better at blocking policies that they oppose rather than reaching compromises on policies that would benefit society. It doesn't help that the KMT still has a lot of work to do to rebound from its last two electoral defeats. But good democracy really does need a credible opposition party. And over several election cycles, the KMT hasn't always done a good job in picking its presidential candidates. And as Taiwan approaches the 2024 election, it will have to present an innovative, the KMT will have to present an innovative policy towards China, one that both Taiwanese voters and the PRC will accept. Most important in the conclusion, I believe, is that the leaders of the two major parties need to create common ground and together forge a broad consensus on how to meet the challenges facing Taiwan. The stakes are too high for continued domestic polarization, obstruction, and delay. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to more questions.
So Hong Kong sees some growing movement in 2014. Taiwan has the sunflower movement in 2014. I was hoping you could elaborate a little more on the relationship between these two and why they're happening in parallel. Is it coincidence that domestic pressures are building and they erupted sort of in parallel, or is there something bigger that's going on?
Well, China would like us to believe that Taiwan has been penetrating deeply in Hong Kong society and making the umbrella movement and protests around it possible. China also believes that the United States is behind this protest movement, even though President Obama publicly denied that, with Xi Jinping standing by his side. The two societies are in a similar point in their social and economic modernization. They've gotten through the middle income trap, and they're now in the high income trap. And there are a lot of people who are losing out, particularly young people. And so it's not surprising that you have a protest culture in both countries. There were added reasons in Hong Kong because the system wasn't as democratic as people wanted. I will tell you that on a visit to Hong Kong while the umbrella movement was still going on, I walked one night with a friend down one of the thoroughfares that had been occupied, and I saw a gentleman in the middle of the road giving a lecture to some people surrounding him, and it sounded an awful lot like he was speaking Chinese with a Taiwanese accent. And he probably was from Taiwan. And there was some technical assistance that Taiwan people gave their Hong Kong counterparts. But I think that these are parallel developments, each with their own dynamic, but each with a sort of an identical or similar context. Okay, so I'm gonna go here and here and here. And I'll keep moving. So you go first.
Thank you for your speech. My question is
Sure.
about Hong Kong.
Yes.
So, could you please provide a bit more analysis on the
Greater Bay.
Yes, the strategy by the
Yes.
Chinese central government.
Yes.
Do you think it is a promising strategy maybe in the next 10 years? And will Hong Kong citizens take it as a repression, or they will be like?
So the Greater Bay Initiative is one that includes Hong Kong and Macau and Shenzhen and the sort of hinterland of Guangdong, right? From an economic geography point of view, this makes a lot of sense. And that there are synergisms or potential synergisms in the economic activity in these various places. And the more barriers to that synergism you break down, the more prosperity is possible. Now, it does require good transportation systems to move goods around, to move people around. You have to make sure you have to have housing for people, education for people. If it's a Hong Kong person who's living and working in Shenzhen, those things need to be taken care of. And the educational systems in these different places is different. You probably know that Taiwanese businessmen in mainland China have set up schools for their children that run a Taiwan curriculum, not a PRC communist curriculum. And you probably know that there's a similar plan to create these large urban agglomerations and increase the economies of scale. So one in North China, one in East China, probably in Central China as well. I expect that some Hong Kong people will decide that that's something that they have to take advantage of for their own material interests. They don't want to work in a factory. They've done that. They're beyond that. But there are a lot of white-collar jobs that would probably result from that. So this may be the kind of incentive that helps reduce the sense of alienation among at least some Hong Kong people. Who had the next one going this way? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. So I was wondering, like, during the current crisis in Ukraine, like, to what extent do you think it will like affect both Taiwan and Hong Kong and even like mainland China's view on this kind of like relations? I know like the situation in Ukraine is like different from that of Hong Kong and Taiwan, but like I think they do have some similarities.
Well, the first difference is that Vladimir Putin was willing to go to war to achieve his objectives. And my interpretation of what Xi Jinping is doing is that he wants to avoid war. That war comes with too many risks and costs. And so he's playing a more clever game. And maybe Putin for a while was trying to use coercion and bluff to get Ukraine back in, but it didn't work. There's a lot of discussion about does what's happened in Ukraine have any implications for Taiwan? Does it give Xi Jinping an opportunity to attack Taiwan while the United States is preoccupied with Ukraine? I tend to believe that Xi Jinping has enough on his agenda right now. First of all, the way Putin has handled this with Xi Jinping has put Xi Jinping in a difficult position with the United States and the rest of the West. Xi Jinping is building up to the 20th Party Congress this fall. And if I were he, I wouldn't want to be fighting a war while that party Congress is going on, especially if the war was going bad. There are people in Taiwan who have concluded, wrongly I believe, that because President Biden said in advance that he wouldn't intervene militarily in Ukraine, that means he wouldn't intervene militarily in a Taiwan conflict. I don't think that's right. I don't know what President Biden would do. It depends on the circumstances. But some people in Taiwan have taken note of how well the Ukrainians have fought with what they have. People are now saying, "Oh, we went too far in reducing the enlistment time for people in the armed forces, and we need to increase that time so that people will be better prepared." And those would be good steps. But I don't. Taiwan's economic dependence on either Ukraine or Russia is pretty small. I suspect that Hong Kong's dependence is pretty small as well, so there won't be an immediate effect. If the sanctions are made more complicated, and Hong Kong and Taiwan companies have to choose between continuing to deal with China and staying on the side of the West, that's a more difficult challenge. So you had a question?
Yes. So, Dr. Bush, I'm wondering whether the U.S. government, or specifically AIT, is pressing KMT to be friendly to mainland China. Because under the current situation, I think it is not rational for it to still adhere to the 1992 consensus, because mainland China has interpreted it as one country, two systems, but KMT still do so. So I'm wondering whether AIT is pressing KMT to do so, like maybe it promised KMT if KMT still adhere to the 92 consensus, AIT would help it influence the next election, because I think after some flower movement, some DPP legislator accused the AIT that AIT tried to help KMT influence the 2016 election.
Well, it's always risky for the United States government to get too deeply involved in an election in Taiwan. The best position we can take is to be neutral. I mean, we will try to build up good communication with both parties so that we're ready for whatever outcome comes along. I think that people in the KMT probably understand that what China's bottom line is, and they probably understand that dealing with China today or in 2024 would be more difficult than it was in 2008. In 2008, Ma Ying-jeou said, "I accept the 1992 consensus. I define the 1992 consensus as one China, different interpretations. My interpretation is the ROC." Beijing never overtly agreed to that. It tolerated it because it basically trusted Ma. It was unhappy that Ma was unwilling to do political talk. So I think that Beijing's demands of a KMT government would be much different in 2022 than they were in 2008. It puts the KMT in a difficult spot. It doesn't. The fact that China is sticking to a hard line is reducing the possibility of creativity all the way around. Other questions? Here, and then I'll go back there.
Go ahead. Thank you for your talk about Hong Kong, Taiwan. It was very interesting. My question particularly relates to Taiwan. Just seeing how because the current policy stance by Beijing to adopt a more corrosive, more just like their current policy approach kind of feels like a little bit like strained, like you said about the creativity. So I was kind of wondering because I view Taiwan and China issue, the cross-strait relation issues, more as a historical issue. Like if you look in a sense, the historical timeline of China is split into two, where there's still an ROC remnant and there's a PRC timeline. So I'm just kind of wondering, what do you think of the perspective of using history, or also even as a farther stretch, using Sun Yat-sen's principles to potentially reunite both Taiwan and China? Do you think there's possibility in that? Do you think the US policy could kind of could use that as a way to advocate unification, like a new creative approach? Or do you think that China's, or you don't think China will approach it because they're still stuck, they still think that their current approach has a way out?
We should note that both in Taiwan and in the PRC, there are some very talented scholars who understand these issues pretty well. And I'm sure that in Track 2 meetings, they have explored some of these ideas. The issue is there, number one, will Taiwan people maintain their confidence in their future, even though Beijing is acting coercively? Number two, is there anything that Beijing could offer Taiwan as a formula for resolving the dispute that would be acceptable to the great majority of people there? Because I think that any change in Taiwan's legal identity requires changes in the ROC constitution. And as you know, that's really hard.
Yeah.
You basically need both the DPP and the KMT to agree. And one can speculate on how that might come about, either voluntarily or involuntarily. But I think that the evolution of identity in Taiwan and the fact that the two sides have had very different histories, and that most people in China don't understand Taiwan's history, means that Beijing is going to have to deal with the situation as it exists today. They can say, we're all part of one family, but I'm not sure people in Taiwan agree. Dr. Kumar.
Thank you. I was surprised to hear the other day one of my students describing Taiwan as a kind of empire. You might actually be here, yes. There we are. You can add to what I'm trying to say, because I never thought of Taiwan as an empire, but Gang Chang's point was that the incoming nationalists in 1949 imposed themselves with considerable violence on the existing Taiwanese Chinese, and of course that sets up a huge kind of tension. So I think the question I want to have is what exactly is the legacy of that kind of conflict, and is the party competition that you've been talking about itself, does it map on to that kind of division, or has there been a fusion and the party conflict is now ideologically different? It's not so much a case of one population imposing itself on another. And the last thing that occurred to me was, again, having talked to some young Taiwanese students actually in Hong Kong a few years ago, they were talking about the pull of Japan, the former colonial master, how much so many of them, she and her friends, were looking towards Japan in a very positive way.
Yes.
And I wondered whether Japan is making any kind of overtures. Where does Japan feature in this whole conflict? Does it play any part at all, or is it sort of taking itself out completely of the discussion?
Those are all really interesting questions, and if I misremember one of them or don't remember one, I will, please remind me. But I think that both of you are referring to a trend in the historical analysis of Taiwan that views the KMT takeover and control of Taiwan through the lens of colonialism.
Yeah.
And that, particularly in the during the authoritarian period, probably made a certain amount of sense.
Unknown caller.
But I'm not sure it makes so much sense anymore. The primary cleavage in Taiwan during the authoritarian period and into the democratic period was between mainlanders and Taiwanese. Taiwanese people whose ancestors had been there for a couple of generations at least. And then the mainlanders, the ones who came over with Chiang Kai-shek. There was good reason that cleavage existed because it was reflected in social arrangements, housing arrangements, in the way conscript soldiers were treated, in schools. Teachers were required to try and impose a conservative Chinese identity on their students. The students learned nothing about Taiwan's history, and they learned everything about Chinese history, and Chinese geography, and Chinese literature. But an interesting thing happened. I mentioned these polls on identity. These started in 1992 when Taiwan was moving towards the end of the transition. And even then, the number of people who identified themselves as being Chinese was fractional. It's like 30%, as I remember. And this is after 4 decades of propagandistic teaching or ideological teaching. And the situation only got worse after that being Chinese went down and being Taiwanese went up, being both went up. Now, the question is, since these terms aren't defined, we can't know the full significance. But I think that over time, this cleavage between, or this perception that the most important cleavage was between mainlanders and Taiwanese started to decline. There were social processes going on that made it more complicated. There was a lot of intermarriage because for Taiwanese men, there weren't a lot of, for mainlander men, there weren't a lot of mainlander women that they could marry. So if they were going to get married, it would have to be a Taiwanese woman. And that created a whole set of complications. But intermarriage over time has blurred this distinction of where your native place is. Also, I think that the issue on which there's the greatest cleavage today is how to deal with the China problem. And it really doesn't matter whether your parents came to Taiwan 70 years ago or whether your parents came from China 300 years ago. It's more based on how you define Taiwan's interests, how you define the threat that China poses, and how you devise policies to best protect Taiwan's interests. The other thing is that people also have a strong consciousness of living in a democratic system. And so in a way, if colonialism was a good lens to study Taiwan, what's happened in the last 30 years is sort of self-generated decolonialization. Other questions? I've got plenty of time.
One here.
Okay, I'll come back over there anytime. Yes.
Me.
Yes.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful talk. So I have a question about the nationalism narratives. So the Chinese CCP party always label it as the aim, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Has always been the slogan of the CCP. And I think it is fair to say that slogan has won significant support or popularity or even legitimacy from the mainlanders. That's why they can always keep in power. But why such slogan has no resonance over the Taiwanese people or Hong Kongese people? I mean, no matter what they politically define them as, Taiwanese or Hong Kongese, they speak the same Chinese language. They use the same symbols. They also celebrate the same festivals. So why such slogan? The rejuvenation of the greater Chinese nation has no resonance over them.
Well, although the majority of PRC citizens are ethnic Chinese, although the great majority of people in Taiwan and Hong Kong are also ethnic Chinese, that need not be the basis for the definition of political entities. And Hong Kong had its own history. Taiwan had its own history. Those histories, in a sense, were defined by opposition to the People's Republic of China. They were defined by the increase in political participation, the partial democracy in Hong Kong, full democracy in Taiwan. So similar to how British people settled in America, British people settled in Australia, British people settled in New Zealand, British people settled in Canada, over time, they came to regard themselves, despite their British background, as, having a different identity, which should be reflected in their own political system. And I think a similar thing is going on with respect to Taiwan and Hong Kong, but the circumstances are very different. But the way that the CCP leadership, particularly Xi Jinping, is defining the future of cross-strait relations, for example, in ethnic terms, is not the only way he could do that. He could propose other arrangements that might be more acceptable to Taiwan people. These would probably involve accepting that Taiwan is what Taiwan people say it is, a sovereign entity, but that's not mutually exclusive with a political union. It would be very hard to set up. But my point is that what the PRC has offered Taiwan has been rejected from day one. And in the process, Taiwan has changed and has become a very different society and polity. The only thing that hasn't changed is one country, two systems. And even that may be changing. It certainly changed in Hong Kong. It's not clear now that that if Taiwan were willing to unify, that they would get the version of one country, two systems that Hong Kong people got in 1997. Beijing's experience with Hong Kong after 1997 suggests that with Taiwan, they're going to have to be stricter than they were in 1997. Yes.
So kind of a follow-up. So you said Hong Kong and Taiwan share a part of different history with the Chinese mainland, but they all share one similar thing, that is the Taiwan and Hong Kong, they all share the same history of the colonization, that is by a Western power, despite Japan is not necessarily a Western power, but both Japan and Britain come to colonize these two previous Chinese territories, and that I think it's a humiliating experience. So given that has a humiliating history and a humiliating experience, why would such slogan kind of a rejuvenation of the greater Chinese nation? Kind of, I think it will have even more resonance than the mainland China, right?
Well, it's a good question. I guess my answer is that for Hong Kong people and Taiwan people, the so-called century of humiliation is not the top issue on their agenda. It's not trivial, but it's not as important, for example, as what sort of political system a unified Taiwan or a unified Hong Kong would be. Moreover, at least from the view of Taiwanese who were living in Taiwan before 1945, and those people lived under Japanese colonial rule for 50 years. Those years were difficult at some times, but the Japanese did do a good bit to modernize Taiwan society. And a sort of strange thing happened after the KMT came and took control that and imposed a harsh rule on Taiwanese people. Those Taiwanese who had lived under Japanese rule, they forgot about the bad parts of it. And because they were being treated so badly by the KMT, they remembered the good parts of Japan's colonial rule. And that's something that goes on in people's minds. So to come back to a question over here, among at least some Taiwanese in Japan, there is Taiwanese in Taiwan today. There's a feeling of attachment to Japan. Japan did a lot to help bring about the Taiwan economic miracle, probably more than the United States did. And there are a lot of attachments. For Japanese looking at Taiwan, the fact that it is a democratic system is an important fact. Moreover, increasingly Japan has come to see China as a threat, and it can see that China is a threat to Taiwan, and so there's more and more talk about cooperation in the security field. Former Prime Minister Abe only a couple of days ago said that he did a video conference with President Tsai, and he said, we need to be talking more. At least the hidden reason was that we face the same enemy. Whether Japan would help the United States in defending Taiwan is another question. And, it's a complicated one. So, gentlemen back there.
Yeah, Taiwan's had a unique position in the world for at least 3 decades, and that's producing the infrastructure for computers and electronics. Taiwanese businessmen were moving lots of things to the PRC. Did they move that electronics computer business to China? And if so, was it successful?
Okay, you have to separate out different parts of it, and some parts, the parts that had become like commodities, those tended to get moved. And the parts where the profit margins were low, those tended to get moved because the cost of doing business on the mainland was less. So anybody who has an HP laptop or a Dell laptop, 30 years ago, that might have been manufactured in Taiwan and shipped from Taiwan to the United States. But as a result of the Asian financial crisis and the bursting of the dot-com bubble around 2000, it became much more economical for the big computer companies like Honhai or Foxconn to move their operations to the mainland and gain the benefits of cheaper Chinese labor. And so China became part of the supply chain. The supply chain was managed by companies in Taiwan. The countless number of small and medium-sized enterprises that worked with those big computer companies, they moved over too. And that was sort of really the golden age of cross-strait economic cooperation. The cost of doing business in China has been growing over the last 10 or 15 years. Wage rates are rising. So either Taiwan companies have to go to some other place or they have to move someplace else within China where the wage rates are still low. But the companies that have been reluctant to change, to move to the mainland are those, for example, that produce semiconductors. The brain power that goes into those things it's too important to protect that. And there's a fear that if you move particularly the high-end chips manufacturer to the mainland, that it's going to get stolen. And so again, the chips that are by now become commodities, those will get produced in the mainland and used in in a number of different products, but the really high-end ones are being produced in Taiwan itself and increasingly in other places like the United States. The TSMC, the big semiconductor manufacturer, is building a plant in Arizona. And so you have a certain amount of diversification going on. Let me come back over there.
Can I ask more about decolonization?
Sure.
So I'm wondering what specifically does this mean? Because I think if the history I know is true, then in 1945, when Chiang Kai-shek took over Taiwan, Taiwanese thought they returned to their homeland. And after the February 28th incident, they started to have a kind of Taiwanese consciousness and thought KMT and ROC regime as a foreign regime imposed on them. And I think, but like after Li Denghui became the president and localized KMT, it seems like most Taiwanese still accept KMT. And nowadays, though they may not identify them as Chinese, but they accept ROC and they accept the national banner of ROC, the totem of KMT. So if you say they once tried to decolonize the influence of ROC, then why they now accept this foreign regime?
The main answer would be that the foreign regime, if that's what you're going to call it, in the end, did some good things for Taiwan. Its political policies, the repression and so on, that was terrible. But the KMT regime understood that it needed to develop the economy, that it could gain legitimacy by improving people's lives, which it did. And it may be that President Jiang Jingguo decided in the early 1980s to move towards democratization. He may have felt that we have a good record. We can run on our record as the creator of Taiwan's prosperity. And the DPP doesn't have anybody who knows anything about economics, which for a time was true. Chen Shui-bian would not have been elected if the leaders of the Kuomintang, including Li Donghui, could have figured out or could have created unity behind the KMT candidate to run for president. But Li Donghui's pick was Lian Zhan, and James Song Chuyu, was determined to run for president. Together, Lian Zhan and James Song, both who grew up in the KMT, together they had 60% of the vote, and Abian had 40%. If the KMT had picked one candidate instead of creating two, history would have been very different. I think that for a while, Ma was very popular, and there was a feeling that prosperity was returning, but then there were the developments that I mentioned. The EPP has had trouble aligning itself or approving of the ROC because of the history of ROC rule. But President Tsai at least has found a reason that it's useful to talk about the ROC Taiwan and to link the two or equate the two, and have people identify with both.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll ask the last question.
Sure.
Because then we have to whisk you to dinner. But I'm going to ask something quite personal. I've been wanting to ask for years.
Okay.
So there's so much behind the scene, and I would agree with you. You've often said the United States play a very important part in Taiwan's democratization. Of course, today you wouldn't want to say that about Hong Kong. That would be illegal. But in those days, this influence, there was a lot of different sort of ways, legislation, support for Dang Wai. I just want to personally, given all that you've done, and every president in Taiwan has sought your support and advice, what is the most satisfying thing you've done as a policymaker in the United States in your long career, and what is the most unsatisfying thing that has happened? Disappointing is a better word.
The most satisfying thing that I think I did was to change the way we talk about cross-strait relations and resolving the dispute between the two sides. For a long time, our position was we have an abiding interest that the differences be resolved peacefully. After Taiwan became a full democracy, it occurred to me that maybe the time had come to amend that formulation to take account of the change in reality. So I had to give a speech in Arizona as AIT chairman, and one of the ways you change policy is through speeches. You put language into a speech that's different from what it was before. So I did my usual speech about cross-strait relations and U.S.-Taiwan relations, and then I added a paragraph. And I said, by the way, Taiwan has changed. It is now a democratic system. The people have gained a seat at the negotiating table. And so from the United States point of view, this is it. We have an interest that the differences be resolved not only peacefully, but in a manner acceptable to the people of Taiwan. And I sent it into the State Department.
Reject it.
No, I was expecting it to be rejected. But a friend of ours, Susan Shirk, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the time. And I fully expected for that paragraph to be crossed out. It came back with just a few stylistic changes. And there's a rule in the US government, text that has been cleared is good text. It is repeatable text, so I kept repeating it.
Like the Supreme Court president.
And then in March of 2000, without my doing anything, Bill Clinton had to give a speech on China and permanent normal trading relationship. He gave it at SAIS across the street from Brookings. And he, in his brief comments about Taiwan, he said basically the same thing. There's an interesting story behind that. But I think that President Obama felt that democracy reserved an emphasis in the way we talk about Taiwan. And that's definitely coming back with the Biden administration. I don't agree completely with the way they talk about it, but the impact of this, I think, is that it puts the burden on the PRC to produce an approach that is acceptable to the Taiwan people. I do think the situation has evolved. When we talked about peaceful resolution, I suspect that if you pushed policymakers, they would agree that peaceful means not only non-violently, but also voluntarily. And that's appropriate. And my sort of addition to the lexicon made what was implicit explicit. But China's now engaged in this coercion campaign. And it's all nonviolent, but its purpose is to create an outcome that is involuntary from the point of view of Taiwanese citizens, that they will, in effect, capitulate, not because they want to, but because they have to. And I think the United States needs to sort of think about how to address Beijing's skill at threading this needle of what peaceful is. And we have to prepare for a real war, but we also have to deal with the psychological war that's being carried out.
Disappointment?
Disappointment? What happened in Hong Kong? No. I was writing my book on Hong Kong through the events of 2013, 2014, 2015. And I was writing blogs at the same time. You know, every day that something happened, I would pound out 200 words. And I thought that maybe there was a chance that Hong Kong could accept an outcome that was good enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And the Hong Kong government had sort of made an effort to make that possible, but the mistrust in Hong Kong at that point and the power of the radicals within the anti-establishment group was relatively great. So that, you know, when it came to decide on that, the decision was, no, we don't want that approach. And I don't know what would have happened to Hong Kong if the anti-establishment forces had accepted a good enough solution. But I think it probably would have been a lot better than what we've seen.
Good. I was going to follow up with that question. Do you think it makes any difference? Since there's a lot of people who are disappointed in that, say today it may not have made a difference. but this is all hypothetical.
That's all hypothetical, and it would have required some self-reflection on the part of the anti-establishment forces about what exactly are their goals, what's the strategy, what are the tactics. If we can't get the maximum that we would like, at what point is a solution or a formula still acceptable? And they never had that conversation. A lot of people are in prison today because they followed that lead.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think this is